You may remember that in your study of the breakup of the kingdom, I want to take you back to the time of Saul, David, Solomon. And Solomon is the first 11 chapters of 1 Kings. And from chapter 12 to chapter 16, there's a time when the kingdom breaks, and it's a broken kingdom. And you start to see for the very first time the broken coalition, broken and failing kingdom. And it reaches its low point in the north in chapter 16 when what king sits upon the throne of the north? Does anybody remember? That would be Ahab. And he will marry a woman who will bring new meaning to the word evil, Jezebel or Isha Baal. And so God will raise up as a response in the north a prophet. Who was it? So this will be Elijah versus Ahab. And that will be primarily a northern tale. It doesn't mean the south is not there, but it means that when you're looking for stories in the south, don't look for a lot of them to fall between 17 and 22. And then who's the next prophet that comes along after Elijah? Elisha. And Elisha will be involved primarily in the north and in Gentile kings, although we do know that, for instance, Jehoshaphat is involved in a southern campaign, and so there'll be a couple of south stories there. And then after the Elisha story, the last part of it is a series of struggles between the kings. And this tends to be north versus south. A lot of it is a north versus south struggle, and so you'll see some of the southern kings come up in here. This period is where we're going to be today. And then I'd like to step away, and part of this day I'd like to talk about where the prophets fit into the kings. So let me suggest to you that we go back to Rehoboam's original story. Now, the original story in chapter 12, Solomon has died. Was Solomon a good king or a bad king? Okay. He had, give me some pros and cons. You've lived under Solomon. Pros. Temple, wisdom, what else? To some extent, God-fearing. There was peace and power and prosperity in the land. Big buildings were undertaken. What started off as basically a junior-sized kingdom looked like a real enduring power under Solomon. Cons. Wives. What else? Incredibly high taxes that just about killed the people. So we pick up the story, and if I have a key principle to frame around the beginning story, and I'd like that beginning story to pick up in chapter 12, I would say chapter 12, say verses 1 to about 21, are the story of life lived for self is gambled and lost. Life lived for self is gambled and lost. I'd call it the big choice. Life invested in serving the Lord is a life that is gained and service approved. But Rehoboam had a father who was a great king. And you can see in 11:42 and 43 at the end of chapter 11, his father was a great king. You also see that in verse 1 of chapter 12, Rehoboam felt entitled to certain loyalties and privileges. That spirit of entitlement did not serve him well. Then Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel had come to Shechem to make him king. He expected the confederation of tribes to name him as his father's successor. Because of the expectation, he did not handle them with respect. Where there is a high view of entitlement, there is a low view of respect. That's one of the reasons an entitlement generation has very little respect for police officers. The higher the entitlement, the lower the respect factor. So he feels entitled. Now, the other thing I notice about him is he surrounds himself. Go down to verse 10, because you know the story. Rehoboam gets together with his counselors. Older guys say, cut the taxes, settle it down. Your father about killed us. The younger guys gave him what advice? What did they tell him to do? Increase taxes and make sure people really know whose place this is. And if your father did it a little, we want you to do it a lot. Your father made our yoke heavy. Now you make it lighter for us, is what some people will say. And then you just say, my little finger will be thicker than my father's loins. In other words, you think he did a lot? You can't believe how much I'm going to do. Now, he surrounded himself with people that fed his ego in verse 10. That's a key mistake. So entitlement in verse 1 is a key mistake. Ego in verse 10 is a key mistake. People that appeal to his ego. For some reason, people in power hire sycophants, people who will come and explain to them how good they are. Let me just go on and say this. Drop your eyes down to verse 18. Because in the beginning of verse 18, you see that he overestimates his own value as their king. Then King Rehoboam sent Adoram, who was over the forced labor, and all Israel stoned him to death. And King Rehoboam made haste to mount his chariot to flee to Jerusalem. He goes in and he thinks he's going to be able to just talk to them and that they're going to receive him because he feels he's rightful king. One of the things that happens is we can get so isolated from reality that we believe whatever we think is therefore true. Remember, if every one of your friends agrees with you, that doesn't mean you're right. It probably means you need to increase your circle of friends. Okay? Probably it means that you got everybody on the same group from the same cause. Now, go on and say, go down to verse 22 for a minute. He also overestimated his own strength and resolve of his own resources. How fast did his resources evaporate? He comes out, he shows this mighty man of force, 180,000 chosen men in verse 21. God speaks and they all go home. Now, if you think you're a way cool king, do you expect some prophet to stand up and then your entire army melt away and it's gone? See, I think Rehoboam overestimated his own value as king, but he also overestimated his own strength. Here's the truth. You're only the leader as long as people follow you. And when they stop following you, you're not the leader. You're just a guy taking a walk. So if you turn around and nobody's following, you can call yourself the leader, take any title you want. People aren't following. And as soon as God spoke, everything evaporated away. Now, that's a fast lesson, and I want to do some of these fast because I want to zero in on a couple of them and really expand them. But step away for a second and go back to chapter 12 and notice that there are also some assets he could have used. I just told you everything that was bad. I'm going to flip it over for a minute. In 1 through 4, 12, 1 through 4, people were open to a dialogue with him. Do you see that? They came to him, and he was going to present himself as king. They were open to a dialogue. It's not like they wrote him off before they heard him. It's that they wrote him off after they heard him. That's a different thing. If you don't like the candidate who's running, but you've never actually listened to them, then you can't honestly say that you've evaluated them. You've only evaluated your own prejudice. But if you heard them and didn't like what you heard or didn't like what their plans were, that's a different thing. Now, in verse 5, I also noticed he had time on his hands. What do I mean by that? He actually takes the time to consider what is being said, which tells me people are not standing around him. It said, depart for 3 days, then return to me. He's got 3 days to sit and consider carefully what to do. So they were willing to dialogue. They gave him time to work out what he wanted to say. I think the third thing in verses 6 and 7 is that he had experienced counselors available to him. Just because he didn't listen to them, it's not because they weren't available. Rehoboam could not go back and say, I didn't have anybody who would tell me the truth. That's not true. He had people standing by that could do that. I will also tell you that in verse 8, he had friends. Don't discount this. That's not nothing. He had friends. So as a ruler, he had some people, and though they did not give him good counsel, it wasn't like he had no counselors to call on and he had no friends and he was isolated by himself. That's not true. So in other words, he had a lot of resources. And I look down at verses 19 and verse 21, and I see some significant resources that belong to him. I'm thinking of just the fact that for instance, in 19, Israel has been in rebellion against the house of David to this day. And you get down to verse 21, when he came, he assembled 180,000 of Judah. He's not broke. He's not alone. So let's take a look at what we just said. We said he had things going against him, but he had things going for him. So life came down to one word: choice. Was he going to choose to take the assets God put in play, or was he going to make the choice to gamble and lose by living for self? So what does he do? He listens to those who appeal to his ego, not to those who appeal on behalf of the people. The younger people that spoke, by the way, younger people aren't always wrong. It's just they're wrong here. The younger people who spoke in this place spoke specifically to feed his ego. The older men spoke to help the people. If you're going to be king, your first allegiance can't be to your own ego, it's got to be to your people. And so he had a choice as to which direction he's going. Okay? Cross off our first lesson and skip chapter 13 because he doesn't come up again in a lesson until chapter 14. And let's keep going with, let's end out Rehoboam's life with very simple, succinct lessons. Okay? I call this trading gold for brass. Trading something of high value for something of low value. I'm picking it up in 14:21 to 26.
Now Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, reigned in Judah. Rehoboam was 41 years old when he became king, and he reigned 17 years in Jerusalem, the city which the Lord had chosen from all the tribes of Israel to put his name there. And his mother's name was Nehemiah the Ammonitess. Judah did evil in the sight of the Lord, and they provoked him to jealousy more than all their fathers had done, and with the sins which they committed. For they also built for themselves high places and sacred pillars in Asherim on every high hill and every luxuriant tree. There were also male cult prostitutes in the land. They did according to all the abominations of the nations which the Lord dispossessed before the sons of Israel. Now it happened in the 5th year of King Rehoboam that Shishak, the king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem. He took away the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house, and he took everything, even taking all the shields of gold which Solomon had made.
What I see is that, first of all, in verses 21 to 24, his disobedience was inexcusable. And what I mean by that is he couldn't say, I didn't know it was wrong. In verse 21, Rehoboam was old enough to know how life worked. Do you see it? By the way, if you keep reading verse 21, he can't say, I was too busy to address that particular issue, because he had long enough to face his choices and to change in verse 21. I don't even want to hear him say, I didn't see any choices, because Rehoboam was in a place where God would and could bless him in verse 21. I don't want to hear, I wasn't warned appropriately, because Rehoboam let the wrong relationships shape his choices. Note Ammonitis in verse 21. Notice that. Why would I notice Ammonitis? His mother was not from Judah. She was not a Judahite. In other words, the sin of Solomon fell over into Rehoboam's life. How do I know that? There's a specific thing that is said. Nehemiah means pleasant one, a beautiful one. She was the Ammonitess, but did you notice that following the word Ammonitess is Judah did evil, and then it goes on and says, sacred pillars, Asherim, male cult prostitutes. That's Ammonite. In other words, from Solomon's bad wife came illegitimate worship, came a son whose mama was there long after wise dad was dead. So the male cult prostitutes become a part of Israel's history as a result of Solomon's bad choice of a wife. So yes, he can say, I wasn't warned appropriately. He knows that there are things that are compromised in his background, and he goes with those compromises. By the way, verse 22 tells me I can't say I didn't know what was happening. Rehoboam didn't take a firm stand to stop his people from the same old spiritual compromises that had happened before. And note every hill in 22 and 23. Do you see it? On every hill. Evil won't stop a counterforce to godliness until it gets everything. You're not going to be allowed to think truth when evil prevails. And as much as I can see in Rehoboam's life, I see that they go to every hill, every luxuriant tree, and they pervert everything. It won't be enough to just have a dirty movie. We just can't have clean ones. It won't be enough to have one place, one channel you can go to. Every channel will have to have it. And what you see is his disobedience was inexcusable. Go down to verses 25 and 26. His disobedience was also costly. Why? Well, disobedience forced God into sending trouble to recall his people in verse 25. God sent trouble to pull the people back because he knew that the wound was going to destroy them. He used the world to correct wayward believers. These are the people of God. And so he sends in trouble so that he can get this done. Now, interestingly enough, if you get down to verse 26, disobedience stole away the testimony of past blessing. It happened in the 5th year of King Rehoboam that Shishak, the king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem. This is the first time you will see a pharaoh or a commander of Pharaoh poking his nose back into Judah's history since they left Egypt practically. There were times when they were looking to Egypt for help, but here, this is an invasion from Egypt. And this invasion does something that's a devastating blow to Rehoboam. I want you to see how empty the present, quote, blessings were. People were walking around going, look at the blessings we have. Look at our big temple. Look at all the nice buildings left behind by Solomon. But God allowed the power symbols of the political rulers to be swept away in verse 26. What symbol gets swept away? The temple's treasures. He took everything. This is, by the way, where some people say the ark was taken. Others will say the ark was hidden, because it doesn't say the ark specifically, but it does say the treasures of the temple. Is not the ark a treasure of the temple? So this is one argument about where the ark gets removed. But here's what we do know. We do know that he also takes away the shields of gold which Solomon had made. I pointed out to you when we were studying Solomon's life that shields of gold are useless. They are symbolic only. You can't take a shield of gold out there and fight against people with iron swords. They will crush your shield, okay? The point is, it was a symbol. They took away all the symbolic blessing. But what I think is interesting is that the disobedience robbed the sense that the future blessing was coming. In verse 26, they took away that sense of the symbolic. And what is he going to have to do in verse 27 to replace it? He doesn't have gold now, so what's he going to do? He's going to put a cheap imitation. What you're going to find is, as a country walks away from God, what once were bastions of truth will become cheap imitations and knockoffs. Instead of being a powerhouse, they'll be the symbols of a powerhouse. There are people in some parts of the world who used to have vast empires. Don't tell them, because they think they still do. There are several countries who still think they're running the world. And Americans are walking around with, we're the one superpower. We're the one superpower, but we can't manage to fix some basic problems in our own country. How quickly the symbolic is robbed and what's left are simply hollow pieces of the past. Now, in verses 27 to 31, I would say not only was his disobedience costly, his disobedience was deliberate. Did you notice in verse 27? When we walk in disobedience, we lie. We substitute real blessings of security with fake ones. And the first thing he does is make fake shields, brass ones, bronze ones, to look like the gold ones. Second, I would say we walk in disobedience. When we walk in disobedience, we try to imitate the blessings that come with obedience, even though we don't have them. I would also say when we walk in disobedience, we often imitate the practices of morality and truth without a walk with God. We got to have a temple. It's got to be operating. We need these big shiny shields. Why? You're not walking with God. The most hollow thing in the world is to see the Congress standing on the steps singing, "God Bless America." Are you kidding me? So the truth of the matter is we have these symbolic senses where we have to do this stuff, but the reality behind it is everybody knows it's a joke. And what you see is those walking in disobedience also know the truth. I'm looking down at verse 28. I'm looking at 29. It happened as often as he entered the king entered the house of the Lord, that the guards would carry them and bring them back into the guard's room, as if there was some big ceremony, but there was no reality. Rehoboam wasn't following God, but he made a real ceremony about going in and out of the temple. And then verse 29. Now, don't you know the rest of his acts? Here's the truth. You can hide, but deliberate disobedience is easy to spot. The only substitute for obedience is repentance. That's the only substitute. When you haven't been obedient, the only substitute is repentance. Renewed obedience. Everything else is going to force you to replace truth for a lie. God gave commandments, mitzvot. He gave chugim, statutes. He gave mishpatim, judgments. And here's the bottom line. We follow those or we lose. So the story closes with Rehoboam sleeping with his fathers, but with a temple that now has fake shields that aren't what the originals were, and a hollowed out center. And that fast into Judah, one step from Solomon, we're already empty on the throne. Now stop for a second. It didn't happen just because of Rehoboam. It happened because of Solomon. The two things Solomon did: one, not train his successor; two, bring his successor from a woman who was foreign with foreign gods. And what did he think was going to happen when he died? So no sooner had Solomon slept, but 17 years later, the kingdom's already decimated, and we already have a huge problem. That gets you through ruler number 1 of Judah. That would be Rehoboam. And ruler number 2 is Abijah, or Abijah, Abijah of Judah. And he's only going to sit on the throne for 3 years. He is a son of Rehoboam. And let me just put one simple lesson. Now, I'm going to 1 Kings chapter 15, verses 1 through 7. Right next to verses 1 through 7, 2 Chronicles 13. Just put it right there, just 2 Chronicles 13 next to 1 to 7. Okay? In 1 to 7, I want you to notice something. God blesses and God disciplines his people. But it's not always immediate. The fact is that today's experience is not simply about his response to today's work. Let me suggest to you that when you look at what happens to Abijah, it's not all about Abijah. It's also about something that flows downhill. Blessing and curse that flows downhill. So I want to take a moment, and I want to take a look at 15, 1 to 7, if I can. And then I want to come and pick up the story of Abijah. Somebody read 15, 1 to 7.
Now in the 18th year of King Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, Abijah became king over Judah. He reigned 3 years in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Maacah, the son of Absalom. He walked in all the sins of his father, which he had committed before him, and his heart was not wholly devoted to the Lord his God, like the heart of his father David. But for David's sake, the Lord his God gave him a lamp in Jerusalem to raise up his son after him and to establish Jerusalem, because David did what was right in the sight of the Lord, and had not turned aside from anything that he commanded him all the days of his life, except in the case of Uriah the Hittite. There was war between Rehoboam and Jeroboam all the days of his life. Now the rest of the acts of Abijah and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? And there was war between Abijah and Jeroboam.
Just to set the scene, go up to 15:1, and let me just give you the idea here. Jeroboam in the north ruled 22 years. You're 18 years into the failed golden calf maker in the north. So his northern neighbor is 18 of his 22 years over by the time Abijah comes to the throne. By the way, Abijah, Abijah, or Abijam are the same person. Okay? So you'll see it's spelled several different ways. You should know that all of those are the same guy. We know that he comes as a grandson of Absalom through Uriel and Tamar, who bore Rehoboam as dad. So he's coming from that line. And we also know that his great sin was a half-hearted personal commitment to the Lord. He only reigns 3 years. And we know that based on what it says about verse 3. He walked in the sins of his father, which he committed before him. His heart was not wholly devoted to the Lord. Look at that phrase for a minute. It didn't mean he didn't believe. It didn't mean he didn't love God some days. It meant that some days he didn't. And in some ways, he's like a lot of believers. He's immature in his faith and erratic in his behavior. Now, let's phrase it in verses 4 through 7, the good, the bad, and the record. Okay, the good, verses 4 and 5. God's blessing didn't immediately leave. For David's sake, the Lord blessed the people. Now, I grew up in a big house, and one thing we did not have too much of were leftovers. We just didn't, because if it was there, we ate it. But on the rare occasion where somebody was sick and there was food left over, you could find a little Tupperware thing on shelf 2 in the refrigerator. Now, you have to understand, when you have 15 kids in one bathroom, okay, it's a pretty brutal existence. And I mean, seriously, if you put anything in the fridge and said, do not touch, it was gone before the door closed, okay? Forget it, because do not touch means eat me, please. So you would do things like hide things, you know, and there were massive numbers of kids moving around like herds of wildebeest and, you know, grazing wherever they could find anything, and you would hide whatever you could. Now, what I can tell you about leftovers is this. God works with leftovers. God will bless or curse on a leftover basis. We talk about the sins of the parents being visited upon the children to the 3rd and 4th generation. But I'd like you to turn it over. Here, in verse 4, the blessing of the parent was visited upon the child, now 3 generations. What you see is, yes, there are leftover blessings. We are living in a country that has great blessing because of the leftover quotient of those who went before us. Now that's the good. When I get down to verse 6, what's the bad? He lives in a constant state of war with his cousins in the north. Why? Because he's not walking with God. Not because, look, the north was bad, but so was he. Peace comes first in the heart, then in the field of battle. And the ruler was such that Rehoboam was going to be constantly in upheaval because he wasn't going to walk with God. And in verse 7, the record is, hey, the rest of the things that he did, they went to the chronicler. But here's the truth. It was a short-lived piece of blessing. Now, I want to zoom in on part of the life of Abijah that is clearly focused on by the chronicler, but it's not focused on here. And to do that, I pointed out to you that there is in 2 Chronicles 13 a passage concerning him. So I would like somebody to read 2 Chronicles 13, 3 through 12, actually 1 through 12, which will give us the battle speech of Abijah or Abijam. 2 Chronicles 13.
In the 18th year of King Jeroboam, Abijah became king over Judah. He reigned 3 years in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Micaiah, the daughter of Uriel of Gibeah. Now there was war between Abijah and Jeroboam. Abijah began the battle with an army of valiant warriors, 400,000 chosen men, while Jeroboam drew up in battle formation against him with 800,000 chosen men who were valiant warriors. Then Abijah stood on Mount Zeroiam, which is in the hill country of Ephraim, and said, Listen to me, Jeroboam, and all Israel. Do you not know that the Lord God of Israel gave the rule over Israel forever to David and his sons by a covenant of salt? Yet Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, the servant of Solomon, son of David, rose up and rebelled against his master, and worthless men gathered about him, scoundrels who proved too strong for Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, when he was young and timid and could not hold his own against them. So now you intend to resist the kingdom of the Lord through the sons of David, being a great multitude, and having with you the golden calves which Jeroboam made for gods for you. Have you not driven out the priests of the Lord, the sons of Aaron and the Levites, and made for yourselves priests like the peoples of other lands? Whoever comes to consecrate himself with a young bull and 7 rams, even he may become a priest of what are no gods. But as for us, the Lord is our God, and we have not forsaken him. And the sons of Aaron are ministering to the Lord as priests, and the Levites attend to their work. Every morning and evening they burn to the Lord burnt offerings and fragrant incense. And the showbread is set on a clean table, and the golden lampstand with its lamps is ready to light every evening. For we keep the charge of the Lord our God, but you have forsaken him. Now behold, God is with us at our head, and his priests with the signal trumpets to sound the alarm against you. O sons of Israel, do not fight against the Lord God of your fathers, for you will not succeed.
Okay, did you hear how incredibly biblical sounding this guy was? I brought you here because when you read the king's account, you don't necessarily hear the part of him that did know God. And what I wanted you to pick out was, what covenant did he refer to with David that God had made? A covenant of salt. Have you seen a covenant of salt before? You may remember that in the offerings, you salt the offerings before they go up. Salt is loyalty. It's a symbol of loyalty in the Bible. So what he's saying is God made a covenant of salt with the household of David. In other words, God is loyal to the household of David. Now, when you read this, a young believer might focus on the fact that he was eloquent and biblical and therefore say, see, he's a good guy. But when you read the book of Kings with the Chronicles account, you see that he's not a good guy. He's sometimes a good guy. When he's good, his theology is real good. When he's bad, he's ignoring his theology. And that happens to how many students in this room? All of us. Now, the point of his life is leftover obedience matters. It mattered with David. Leftover disobedience matters. It's going to matter for many of these kings. So what I do today does echo into eternity. That's what you need to take away from his life. Abijah has to learn that what he does echoes into eternity, and the blessing he receives is because what happened in David's life, now generations before him, echoes into his life. You have the benefits of people who walked with God before you, and you have the problems of people that walk with God before you. Some of you are going to hear a phrase that is bandied in the church a lot. The phrase is generational curses. But you do not hear the phrase generational blessings. They are exactly the same. Okay? All it means is this. You are who you are, in part because of your choices, and in part because of the people who went before you. You got your nose from your mom, or your dad, or your grandma. You got the color of eyes from the combination of chemicals in your mother's womb. And the fact of the matter is, some things are, we're not going to call it nature, we're going to call it God. And some things are nurture, and that is the social environment that you're in. But let's be open to the idea that God actually blesses even nature, not just nurture. That you can pray, seek God's face, and he'll give you great-grandchildren that you would not have otherwise had. Where do I get that? Follow me, Deuteronomy 5, 6, and 7. Listen to my words. You'll have a long and prosperous life, and your families will settle down and have a great future. I'm giving that to you if you'll follow me. Now, you can't go back and do anything about yesterday, but you can start today, and change tomorrow. And all I'm trying to say is, here's a guy who you probably didn't even ever hear of before you sat down to read through the scriptures at the beginning of the year. And the bottom line is, your life echoes into eternity, and so does his. So I want you to go away with, God can make an arrangement with one person because of their obedience, and that covenant of loyalty will follow long after you're gone. I want you to live for God as you raise your children, but I want you to walk with God before you ever even have them. Because you don't, look, your walk with God right now will help you choose the right mate, should God even want you to have one. That means that you'll be on the right corner at the right time doing the right thing. That means that the nose of your child will take on his characteristics, ladies, and you don't even know him yet. Okay? It's not, I'll walk with God in all the big things and I'll run my life in the small ones. It's not that. The small ones are the big ones. That's what puts you on the right corner at the right time.